All right. Excellent. Okay, so truth and narrative. So truth is what we in the language teaching business call an abstract noun. Okay? And so an abstract noun, right, is as different from, say, a chair or a table or a glass of water, which is what we call a concrete noun. It's something that you can't directly perceive with the senses. So, you know, things like love or friendship or gratitude or truth, right? Something that can't easily define, yet we all supposedly know what it is. But do we? Ooh. As Force Ghost Obi-Wan famously told Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. A sort of truth is in the eye of the beholder. Abstract indeed. So my therapist has a poster which hangs in her office that looks like this, which I think nicely explains the sort of human relationship to truth as Obi-Wan Kenobi would have it, which is, so if you look at this here, right, you have the sort of object in the center, right, this is truth, and then this is true and this is true, as in, you know, if I'm standing over here and I look at this, right, it looks like a circle. And instead, if I go to the other side and I look at this object, right, it appears to be a square. Okay? Of course, the problem is we can never stand on both sides of this object at the same time. Right? So I can never see what you're seeing, and you can never see what I'm seeing. Okay? So what do we do with that? Okay? So while to me it appears to be a circle, and to you it appears to be a square, right? How do we find this objective truth in the center, right? Like I said, they can't see what I'm talking about, and I can't see what they're talking about. Well, I could just reject their assessment out of hand and say, no, that's clearly a circle, right? But if I'm at least a little bit open-minded, I should at least try to walk across the stage and look at it from the other person's perspective and see that, yes, indeed, it does look like a square from their perspective. Now, at this point, I'm faced with three possibilities, right? So I come over here and I say, oh, hey, that looks like a square. Possibility the first is I can forget that it looked like a circle from the other side and just reject my initial perspective and say, you know what, you were right, it looks like a square. Okay? Option two, I can deny what I see from the other side and say, no, I saw it from the beginning, it was a circle, I know it's a circle. Right? Or, right, option three, I can sort of take the two perspectives together and say, okay, maybe there's some truth in both points of view, and accept that maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture from any one sort of standpoint, okay? So now I'm faced with accepting the truth that the object could be somehow both a square and a circle, okay? Like Obi-Wan said, it basically all depends on our point of view. Now, if I do choose number three, the trick is remembering the larger truth when I walk back over here to my side, and it clearly only looks like a circle again. Oh, and of course, most things in life don't just have two perspectives, right, and are not quite so simple as to be able to see from just two perspectives, okay? And so without sliding into a position of relativistic truth where all infinite possibilities are equally valid, et cetera, we can still admit, and still hopefully all agree on, that our limited existence as humans allows for limited perception, and that in turn might make finding any singular absolute truth on most issues essentially an impossibility for just about any question. Except, of course, to the question of which Metallica album is the best, it's clearly Ride the Lightning. Anyway, but let's leave the larger question of absolute truths aside for the moment and just sort of focus on the idea of perspective. Oftentimes, it's not possible for me to just merely walk to the other side of the room and see that the object doesn't look like a circle from where you're standing. Or in my particular field, ancient medieval history, this shifting of perspective can be especially difficult because often we're lucky to have even one perspective, one surviving perspective on any given issue. So, denied the existence of other perspectives, determining the truth of history is largely just a process of weaving together whatever disparate narratives happen to come down to us. And then we try to construct a sort of coherent narrative out of that, that we as humans can understand in our limited abilities of perception. But But I would argue that it is, in fact, this process of construction of the narrative that often teaches us more about truth and more about ourselves than the constructed narrative. I want to tell you my own personal narrative, acknowledging from the outset as an act of construction. Right? This is how I've constructed the narrative of my own life. It's a little long, and it's a little convoluted at times, but I think it illustrates my point well, so bear with me. Okay, here goes. So when I was 12, I had a video game called Genghis Khan 2, Clan of the Grey Wolf. It was a strategy game where you selected a world leader based on, a number of attributes, politics, leadership, war, and charm, right? And then you had to govern a region, levy taxes, raise an army, even produce heirs, and ultimately conquer the world. It was basically a more sort of complicated video game version of Risk. Something pretty common now, but it was pretty advanced for 1991. Anyway, after playing for a while, I discovered that my favorite character was not the titular Genghis Khan, nor even the seductively named Richard the Lionheart of England, but rather someone I had never even heard of called Philip II of France. Okay, there he is. And he was my favorite because he was the most balanced of the characters. Unlike Richard, who's E in politics, yes, E, don't ask me why the programmers didn't, like any reasonable grading system, go directly from D to F. But anyway, whose E in politics meant that it cost Richard twice as many move points to do even simple actions like spy on a neighbor, which offset his A in war and charm. Whereas Philip's 3 Bs made for a much smoother conquering experience. It was all kind of even, right? Now, I knew the game was supposed to be sort of loosely based on history, since I'd heard of Richard and I'd heard of Genghis Khan, so I assumed Philip must also have been real. And 12-year-old me began to ask myself, well, what is that reality? As in, this character in a video game was developed by programmers in Japan over 800 years after he lived, right? So how did they know that Philip was an A in politics and a B in everything else? What was this based on? Was it just random, or was it for the purpose of the game, or did it actually reflect some sort of larger reality of history? So, in the time before the internet, I went to the only place that you could back then for this kind of information, my family's 1972 World Book Encyclopedia. The article was brief, only about 5 paragraphs, and it went roughly like this: known as Philip Augustus, first great king of the Capetian dynasty. He was a clever statesman who went on the Third Crusade with Richard the Lionheart, made some governmental reforms, yada, yada, yada. This laid the basis for the growth of the French monarchy in later times. Therefore, the article did seem to confirm most of what the video game had already implied. Philip was indeed a talented king who was, pretty average or above average, who succeeded in expanding his power and passing it down to his heirs, which were the most important things a king was expected to do, both in real life and in Genghis Khan 2, Clan of the Grey Wolf. Much the same was also true about Richard. His longer World Book article, that Richard was a successful general, etc., meriting his A in war, but much less successful politically speaking. He left no direct heir apart from his boneheaded younger brother, John, an act which by itself could have earned him the dreaded E in politics. Okay? So ultimately I was satisfied. The ratings given with the characters seemed to line up with what the World Book told me. Okay? But soon another question started to sort of crop up into my mind, which is, how did the authors of the 1972 World Book know this? Where is their information coming from? Basically, how did Philip Augustus of France, or Richard, or Genghis, go from living, breathing human beings to a 5-paragraph entry in the World Book Encyclopedia, whose then could be rolled over into a video game character whose entire person could be summed up in a 4-category, 5-letter scale? And while this question may seem dated, right, we don't rely on the 1972 World Book anymore, it's no less relevant now than it was in 1991. And in fact, the answer is more or less the same if I were to go to Philip's Wikipedia article. It's much longer than the entry in the 1972 World Book, right? But the question is still essentially the same. Where did they get this information? What I didn't know back then was what I was asking myself is essentially the central question of what we call historiography, the writing of history. As in, how does history get written? right? Who decides what gets written down about whom and when? Unfortunately, my local small city library was woefully understocked when it came to, medieval history and the nuances of ruling medieval France. So many of my questions remained unanswered. But as I went into high school, I remember being very excited to sign up for AP World History, and I slowly began to tell myself that this was my destiny, to learn all the intricacies behind this guy Philip and what made him great or not. I remember the disappointment when I got to that first day of junior year and we got our AP World History books, and I flipped to the index in the back to look for Philip. And I found him, and there was only one page number listed next to him, and I go to that page, and it was just the same facts that I sort of already knew from the World Book, right? Third Crusade, governmental reforms, able administrator, Richard and John, yada, 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 okay? So, even worse than this was, 2 months into the class, after we spent, some time on the Greeks and the Romans and yada, 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 when we finally got to the Middle Ages, we spent one day, 45 minutes on the entire 1,000-year period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. And guess what? We didn't even mention Philip once in the whole time, okay? But I hadn't given up yet. Okay? When I began college the next year at Boston University, the first class I signed up for was HI 203, Medieval History. And I was delighted to find out that we were going to spend, 15 weeks, 45 hours on the period that we had somehow covered in 45 minutes in high school. And that, in fact, that was just the first class. There were actually 6 or 7 different classes related to various aspects of life in different places in the Middle Ages. So during that first semester, I learned all kinds of new things, and yes, we did talk about Phillips at some point. But one thing that I kept hearing over and over was, oh, this is based on the Roman this, or this medieval aspect of medieval culture is based on ancient Roman language or culture, etc. So I signed up to take a Roman history class in the spring. Now, my medieval professor had been good, but this guy was incredible. Okay? This guy, Professor Salmons, made every story, every anecdote absolutely fascinating for students, and everyone, including myself, were like visually disappointed when the class ended, when the hour was up, and we didn't get to hear any more of his stories. And so I decided I wanted to figure out, I want to do what he does, and how can I do this? I want to spend my life researching questions of history and then relating them, whatever I find, to my audience in sort of captivating fashion, full of classrooms of eager students who just couldn't wait to hear the next story I had to tell, the way that we all listen to Salmons. So late in the semester, I went to his office, and I asked him, how do I do what you do? And in his sort of distinctive southern drawl, he quickly informed me that if I wanted to do what he does, that I had to learn Latin. And I was like, what? Latin? No, only nerds take Latin. But if I wanted to study medieval history with any sort of seriousness, I would need to learn Latin. He also warned me, to his credit, that becoming a professor would be extremely difficult, an uphill climb that I shouldn't undertake at all costs unless I couldn't conceivably see myself doing anything else. Okay, if this was the only job I could imagine myself doing. I didn't even need a moment to reconsider. I already decided, yes, this is exactly what I must do. So even though it was only offered at 8 in the morning next semester, I signed up for Latin immediately, okay? And I started studying right away. Surely this was my destiny, and studying Latin was not going to get in the way, right? I had to become this professor of medieval history, and I was going to know everything there was to know about Philip Augustus and where that information had come from, okay? There would be no stopping me. Then, of course, life got in the way. Learning Latin proved much more difficult than I thought. Some early successes were starting to get forgotten under an increasing number of failures. I was trying to rush so quickly to play catch-up with the other kids who had taken Latin in high school that my report cards were starting to look more like Richard's chart than Philip's, a lot more E's and D's and stuff mixed in there. So anyway, a talking to from the classics department chair and a failed love affair convinced me that, you know what? I gotta cut my losses and just get the heck out of Boston and find a new path. So a spring break trip to Europe had made me decide that leading tours in Rome might be a good way to, well, it's not working somehow. Sorry. There you go, sorry. might be a good way to sort of use my love of history and my knowledge and my passion for storytelling in a setting that didn't require me to be a perfect student or to be an expert Latinist. Okay? So I moved to Rome in the spring of 2002 to begin my new career. And I found it did indeed suit me well, and that, despite my earlier struggles with Latin and Greek and even, Spanish in high school, Italian somehow came very easily to me. I worked at it for sure, but soon I felt confident in communicating. From time to time, I would dust off my Latin books and try to return to it, and I showed some improvement, mostly thanks to knowing the words better from Italian, but it was still pretty slow going. I've since learned that the real problem was largely how I was taught Latin rather than the language itself, but that's a topic for another day and another time. And although it was generally very happy, I was generally very happy with my life, I constantly felt destiny nagging at me. Every day when I went to work and met tourists to take them to the Colosseum of the Vatican, and they would ask me like, oh, what's your plan? I would still tell them, I'm going to be a medieval history professor one day. That was still my plan. So in the winter of 2006, I made a pilgrimage to Baltimore to meet a man named John Baldwin. Okay? And he was the world's foremost expert on Philip Augustus. Okay? He had recently retired, but I had read his book, The Government of Philip Augustus, cover to cover several times, in which he had described in detail all those governmental reforms that I had learned about way back when in the 1972 World Book. Okay? And so I asked him what he thought I should do, and he instead turned the question immediately back on me and said, what do you think you should do? To which I, without thinking, quickly responded, translate the Philippide. And he said, that's a good start. Okay? The Philippide, by the way, is a 12-book epic poem written in complex, classical Latin about the life of Philip in poem form, okay? And as I would come to find out, it was actually very influential in shaping how we still think about Philip nowadays, including, of course, the World Book and Genghis Khan II, Clan of the Grey Wolf, okay? However, that fall, I was not accepted into any of the PhD programs I applied to, partially because of my less than perfect undergrad grades, I was told. So instead, they informed me that I should try and get an MA somewhere to sort of prove myself first. This meant more time and more money I didn't have, but this was destiny. So I applied and was accepted to an MA program at the University of New Hampshire for the fall of 2008, and I took out loans to pay for it, like $50,000 worth of loans. My school experience there was entirely different from my undergraduate career. I was 10 years older, wiser, I had a plan, and I had a mission. And I worked like crazy, and it paid off. I won scholarships, I won awards, I impressed my professors. Most importantly, I was finally able to actually read those Latin sources about Philip now in Latin. My MA thesis was a first ever English translation of Book 1 of the Philippide, and it won the university's award for the best thesis that year. And I was told I would be a shoo-in for any PhD program I applied to. But yet again, it was not to be. Another round of PhD applications, another round of rejections. This was utterly devastating. I floundered, I sunk into depression. I had no backup plan. This was destiny. This was supposed to be my destiny. I'd been telling people for over 12 years, I'm going to be a professor of medieval history. What could I do now? So I sort of stumbled around trying to find something to do. I briefly found a job as an adjunct professor at Plymouth State University, where I got paid about $16,000 a year to be a full-time professor. They called me Professor Stringer, which was nice. And I got to teach exactly what I wanted. Going into the second semester, they said, oh, you can design any classes you want. And so I said, oh, let me teach medieval France and ancient Rome. That's my favorite stuff. My evaluations were great. The students loved me. But I didn't get paid enough to even support myself. My mom had to give me her car so that I could drive there, right? I couldn't pay my loans for my master's degree. I had to put those all on hold. So as I sort of fumbled around for a new direction, I had a sort of seemingly chance encounter with a former professor from BU, not Salmon, someone else. And this led me to sort of pursue a more secure career in teaching high school Latin. Of course, this meant going back to school again, leaving Philip aside, at least for a while. But it did give me a renewed sense of purpose and motivation. as I grew in my new career, I found other outlets for doing the things that I loved, bringing people to Rome, students to Rome, bringing adults, presenting at conferences, Latin-centered study abroad trips, all this sort of stuff. And in a strange twist of fate, my involvement in these things actually led last year to an invitation to the International Congress on Medieval Studies to present in Latin on the Philippine. What? So, what is the truth, capital T, of my story? Was it my destiny to be a medieval history professor? And if so, did I therefore fail? Okay? Or was it to unravel the mystery of the Philippine, and therefore did I succeed? I did largely succeed in eventually doing that, finding out where those game designers at Koi had gotten their rating system for Philip Augustus in Genghis Khan II, Clan of the Grey Wolf. But I did not get a PhD, and I did not become a university professor. And that perceived failure often obscured me from the truth, right, that I could find the truths, little t, that I had sought, albeit be a different path than what I had envisioned. So in my narrative, right, where I also wanted to be a professor at a university, right, in that aspect, I mean, I guess I failed, right? I didn't become Salmons. And so this is, not what the plan had said. But yet, in some way, only briefly, I had been Professor Stringer, right? And I had got to teach the classes, and I largely day in and day out get to teach what I want to now and write articles and publish research that other experts in the field, read and even cite in their papers at the biggest forum in my field. So I think in the end, the only truth, big T, is surprise, surprise, both of these narratives are true, right? And it all depends on our perspective, as Obi-Wan said, right? And I can choose which way to look at it, right? And while it might be soothing to see my journey exclusively as a success, ultimately I choose to look at it both ways. I choose to see it partially as a failure, both as a cautionary tale for myself and for others, an important admonition that often the path from A to B is not as direct as we think, and it's not a straight line that we think it is, and that hard work and persistence are no guarantee of outward recognition or accomplishment of the goals we want to achieve, okay? Especially those which require complex external forces, such as admissions committees or acceptance to universities or graduate programs, etc. And also I choose to see it as a failure, as a reminder that we as humans, on our limited perspective, often can't see the capital T truth of the intrinsic meaning of our actions, right? And yet I also see it as a success, right? That in some ways I, fulfilled this mystical destiny of finding the answers to the mystery of Philip Augustus, and that hard work and persistence was how I got there, and it allowed me to produce research that I'm still proud of, and perhaps most importantly, right, that even if unintentionally, right, all that hard work, all that struggle led me ultimately to a meaningful and fulfilling career where I get to interact every day with amazing young people and help them as they start on their own quests for knowledge. So, thank you.